Truth sees God, and wisdom contemplates God. And from these two comes a third, a holy and wonderful delight in God, who is love.
History isn't always written with a pen. Like we have this really comforting assumption that the historical record is just this steady accumulation of what happened.
Right, like scholars just carefully adding their little page to this great big pile of human knowledge.
Exactly. But honestly, just as often, history is actually written with an eraser. I mean, it's about what gets actively, systematically, and sometimes violently scrubbed right out of existence.
Yeah, the things that are deliberately forgotten.
Which brings us to today. We are welcoming you, the listener, as the third person in the room for a brand new deep dive. And today, we are looking at one of the most successful erasure jobs in all of Western history.
It's a wild story.
It really is. So our mission today is to explore a 2,000-year-old intellectual battle, uncover a literal lost text that came dangerously close to redefining a major world religion, and really understand exactly how history is curated by the victors.
Which is such an important topic. And our main source for this today is a fascinating collection of excerpts from the Marcionite heresy and the Lost Antitheses.
Right. So we are going to look at a man named Marcion, his massively popular second century movement that just completely rejected the Old Testament, his banned Book of Contradictions, and the incredibly ironic way modern scholars actually know what that destroyed book said.
Yeah, to even begin to understand this lost text, you really have to feel the sheer scale of the threat it posed to the early Christian establishment.
Set the stage for us.
Well, picture a bustling ancient Mediterranean port city in the 2nd century. The air is thick with trade. You've got different languages, competing philosophies. That is the world Marcion came from.
A real melting pot.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to remember, in the mid-100s CE, Christianity is still in its absolute infancy. Like, it does not have massive cathedrals or, a finalized Bible yet.
It's just figuring itself out.
Right. It's this messy, emerging marketplace of ideas, and it's trying desperately to forge its own identity.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're looking at around 144 CE, right?
Yeah, roughly.
And into this really chaotic marketplace walks Marcion, along with various other thinkers that our sources identify as early Gnostics, like the Valentinians and the Scythians.
Mm-hmm. Well, Marcion looked at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and he looked at the God depicted in there. A God who demands strict obedience, who commands armies, who punishes entire generations.
Yeah, pretty heavy stuff.
And then he looked at the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament, which was this message of radical grace, forgiveness, and a purely loving spiritual father. Marcion concluded that these simply could not be the same character.
So he essentially argued that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament were two entirely separate deities.
Exactly. He drew a hard line. He argued that the creator God of the Hebrew Bible was the architect of this harsh physical world and all its rigid laws.
Right.
But the Father revealed by Jesus was like an alien God, a higher, wholly good, purely spiritual entity who only stepped into this flawed creation out of pure mercy just to save humanity from the Creator's harsh justice.
And he didn't just write, a think piece about this. I mean, he took out a scalpel.
He really did.
According to the sources, he created what is widely believed to be the earliest compiled Christian biblical canon, but his version of the Bible had zero Old Testament.
None at all.
He scrubbed all Jewish influences. His scripture was limited to just an edited version of the Gospel of Luke and 10 of the Apostle Paul's letters, so 11 books. That was his entire Bible.
And the demographic numbers from the sources regarding his movement are just staggering. I mean, this was not a fringe guy shouting on a street corner with a dozen followers.
Yeah, this blew my mind.
Right. In the mid to late 2nd century, Marcionites and their allied groups made up roughly 30 to 50% of all Christians in certain eastern regions.
50%.
Yeah, in places like Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt.
Yeah.
And even empire-wide, they were probably 20 to 30% of the entire Christian population.
That statistic is just wild. It completely upends the way I usually imagine early church history.
It really does. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it shatters a very persistent historical illusion. We often fall for this myth of the minority of a minority.
Like the idea that heretics were always these tiny, secretive splinter groups hiding out in basements.
Yes, exactly. The reality is that in a 2nd century Roman town, groups like the Marcionites operated entirely in the open. The everyday average Christian didn't see a bright neon line between what was orthodox and what was heretical.
They just went to whatever Christian community was down the street.
Exactly. Which means the guys who eventually won, the proto-Orthodox leaders, as our sources call them, were in absolute panic mode.
Proto-Orthodox, right. So that term just refers to the early church fathers whose theology eventually became the mainstream Christianity we know today.
Spot on. Men like Irenaeus, Polycarp, and Tertullian. And they were terrified. Tertullian famously complained that Marcion's network had, quote, filled the whole world. Yeah, they were losing ground. So they wrote these voluminous, aggressive texts, which are known as polemics. Yeah. Essentially formalized, hostile verbal attacks.
Because there was a very real possibility that this Old Testament rejecting faction might just become the permanent, dominant form of Christianity.
Exactly. It was a crisis.
So how did Marcion actually convince all these people that if your message doesn't resonate, people just won't show up?
It comes down to his manifesto, right? This lost book called The Antitheses.
Yes. And the title translates directly to contradictions. Marcion's guiding rule for this book was actually drawn right from a teaching of Jesus. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit.
Okay, makes sense.
Marcion's logic was dangerously straightforward. He argued that because the actions of the Old Testament God were harsh, punitive, and sometimes seemingly volatile, well, that entity must be a bad tree.
Right, and therefore had to be completely separate from the holy good God of Jesus.
Exactly. Here's where it gets really interesting for me. I was reading through how he structured this book, and I found myself wondering, was Marcion essentially acting as the world's first biblical literary critic?
Oh, that's an interesting thought.
Because he wasn't inventing a new mythology out of thin air. He wasn't writing fan fiction. He was taking two existing, widely read texts, putting them side by side, and forcing the reader to deal with the tonal whiplash.
I really like that phrase, tonal whiplash, because that was the entire goal. Imagine a split screen, right? Or an ancient manuscript divided right down the middle. That was Marcion's methodology.
A direct comparison.
Yes. He placed the teachings of the Old Testament right next to the teachings of the New Testament to argue they were fundamentally incompatible. And this was incredibly dangerous to the proto-Orthodox Church because it was a logical, evidence-based argument.
Using their own scriptures against them.
Exactly. It resonated deeply with everyday people who were genuinely struggling to reconcile these severe ancient laws with this radical new message of grace.
And he grouped these contradictions in ways that must have felt like a gut punch to a new convert. Let's look at the theme of justice versus mercy. He would pull the foundational legal code from Exodus, right? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and put it right next to Jesus saying, if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also.
Yeah, the contrast is stark. And he also contrasted physical violence with spiritual healing.
Oh, right, the hand imagery.
Yeah, the visual imagery he used was brilliant. He compared the physical postures of the leaders chosen by these deities. So in the Old Testament, during a battle against the Amalekites, Moses climbs a hill and holds his hands up high to ensure the violent military slaughter of Israel's enemies.
Right.
Marcion juxtaposes that with Jesus, who also climbs a hill and stretches his hands out on the cross.
Yeah.
But Jesus does it to suffer quietly and offer universal salvation.
Wow.
Yeah, the contrast in the use of outstretched hands, one for military slaughter, one for ultimate sacrifice, is just an incredibly potent rhetorical trap.
It really is. And he didn't stop at just the laws or the prophets. I mean, he went after the actual character and temperament of the deity. He argued the Old Testament God was volatile and localized.
What's a good example of that?
Well, he points to moments where God uses nature as a weapon, like in the book of Amos, causing the sun to go down at noon to punish Israel with darkness. And then he puts that next to Jesus, saying, the true Father is universally generous, making his sun rise on both the evil and the good.
That's a great example. And he pressed that nerve even harder when discussing the treatment of the vulnerable.
The bear story.
The bear story, yes. He pulled a story from 2 Kings where the Creator God sends a curse that causes wild bears to emerge from the woods and maul 42 children simply because they mocked the prophet Elisha.
Reading that story next to the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus actively rebukes his own disciples for pushing youngsters away and says, let the little children come to me, is just jarring.
It really is.
Marcion is basically grabbing the reader by the shoulders and saying, how can you possibly tell me these two beings are the same guy?
And then there's the theme of blindness versus sight. Like Elisha cursing a Syrian army with total blindness.
Oh, yeah, and Jesus mercifully restoring a blind man's sight on the side of the road.
Exactly. He hammers home the volatility of the Creator by showing the Old Testament God openly proclaiming his own jealousy. In Exodus, the deity states, "I am a jealous God."
Right.
In 1 Samuel, he explicitly admits to regret, saying it repents him that he set up Saul to be king. Marcion contrasts this volatile, regretful entity with the Father revealed by Jesus.
A being who possesses total foreknowledge, who never makes mistakes, he has to regret.
And who exhibits zero jealousy. When you absorb all those arguments back to back, you can completely understand why a second-century citizen found this so persuasive.
Absolutely. Which brings us to a massive historical paradox.
Right.
We'll just walk through all these highly specific, deeply analytical arguments from the antitheses, but there is a glaring problem. No original copies or manuscripts of this text have survived to the modern era.
Not a single page.
Entirely wiped off the face of the earth. So why wasn't this just a vigorous theological debate? Like, why did it result in total erasure?
Because debate wasn't working. The Proto-Orthodox Church realized that Marcion's logic was just too infectious. They couldn't out-argue him. They had to starve the ideas of oxygen.
Wow.
The erasure was methodical, and it happened in a two-stage process. Phase 1 was passive censorship. Scribes and leaders instituted a strategy of damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory. And this lasted for about 150 years.
Okay, I understand how you cancel someone today, but how do you passively censor a massively popular book across the entire ancient Mediterranean?
You leverage the biological reality of ancient media. Books didn't exist in the cloud, or on hard drives. They were written on papyrus or parchment rolls.
And papyrus rots.
Exactly. It degrades relatively quickly in most climates.
Wow.
A book only survived if someone painstakingly copied it by hand onto new material.
I see.
Because mainstream Christian scribes viewed Marcion as the ultimate threat, the arch-heretic, they simply refused to copy his works. Mainstream congregations instituted a quarantine.
They just blacklisted it.
They banned the possession of Marcionite texts because they literally believed that reading them would contaminate your eternal soul.
So what does this all mean for the flow of information? If I can put this in modern terms for you listening right now. Phase 1 was essentially a decentralized cultural boycott. It was an ancient shadow ban.
A shadow ban, I like that.
Yeah. The mainstream community refused to share your content. They warned others not to engage with it, and the algorithm of history just buried it as the physical papyrus literally rotted away.
The shadow ban analogy works so well for those first 150 years, but passive censorship wasn't quite enough to kill it entirely because Marcion's breakaway churches had their own money and their own scribes.
Right, they were still copying it themselves.
Exactly. So the real death blow required a shift in power. It required phase 2, active imperial suppression.
Enter the Roman Empire.
Yeah. And this raises an important question about how history is formed.
Right.
In 313 CE, Emperor Constantine legalizes Christianity.
A huge turning point.
Suddenly, the Proto-Orthodox Church isn't just a theological movement debating in town squares. It has formed an alliance with the ultimate hard power of the ancient world.
Right, they have the state on their side now.
And Constantine doesn't care about the nuances of the demiurge. He wants a unified religion to act as a glue for his fracturing empire. Division is a threat to state security. So by 331 CE, he issues a strict edict against heretics.
And reading the details of this edict in the sources, it is no longer a spiritual quarantine. It is raw physical enforcement.
Very physical.
The state stripped Marcionites of their meeting houses, it banned them from gathering publicly or privately, and it ordered the immediate confiscation and destruction of their books.
And later on, formalized Christian legal codes actually made possessing heretical texts a serious crime against the state.
So the Proto-Orthodox leaders provided the theological justification, but the Roman state provided the swords and the fire. To carry our earlier analogy forward, phase 2 is the government stepping in. They declare your website a felony, they send armed guards to physically seize your servers, and they just burn the data centers to the ground.
It's brutal. The flattening of this massive movement didn't happen purely because the Orthodox theological arguments naturally won out in the free market of ideas.
Right.
It happened because the surviving narrative of history is incredibly dependent on who holds the state monopoly on violence and law.
Okay, but this leads to the absolute most mind-bending part of our whole deep dive today.
Yeah, this is the irony.
Let's follow the logic here. If the Roman Empire successfully rounded up and burned every single copy of the antitheses, and the Marcionite scribal infrastructure was totally dismantled by the state.
How do we know anything about it?
Yeah. How did we just spend 10 minutes talking about the exact contradictions Marcion wrote down? Where did the historians get the examples about Moses' hands and the bears attacking the children?
That is the ultimate historical irony. Modern scholars only know the contents of the antitheses because of Marcion's greatest, most obsessive enemy.
I cannot get over this detail. It is just so perfectly human.
Right. So we mentioned an early proto-Orthodox theologian named Tertullian. He was a brilliant, highly aggressive writer, almost a lawyer type in his rhetorical style.
Very combative.
Extremely. He was so utterly repulsed by Marcionism that he wrote a massive 5-volume hostile polemic called Ad versus Marcionum, or Against Marcion.
5 volumes of just pure hatred.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Tertullian was determined to dismantle Marcion intellectually, brick by brick. He felt that summarizing Marcion's arguments wasn't enough. He needed to expose their flaw in the open light.
Oh, boy.
So to refute the antitheses, Tertullian quoted it line by line.
It is exactly like trying to reconstruct a permanently deleted social media account entirely by reading the angry, obsessive quote tweets from their biggest hater.
It's the exact ancient equivalent of that. Modern scholars have had to act like forensic detectives here. Picture a scholar's desk, just covered in fragments of ancient text.
Piecing it all together.
Yeah, they go into the surviving Orthodox texts of Tertullian, as well as other church fathers who wrote similar hit pieces, and they meticulously extract Marcion's original voice right out of their hostile rants.
Yeah.
They just peel away Tertullian's angry commentary to reveal the quotes hidden inside.
They reverse engineered the banned book using the very tools meant to destroy it.
Exactly. In their absolute furious zeal to completely destroy Marcion's logic, the early church fathers accidentally became the only people to preserve it for eternity.
That's amazing.
By quoting him so extensively to prove him wrong, they effectively became an unintentional backup drive for the very heresy they were trying to eradicate.
Truth sees God, and wisdom contemplates God. And from these two comes a third, a holy and wonderful delight in God, who is love. Wouldst thou learn thy Lord's meaning in this thing? Learn it well.
Love was his meaning.
Who shewed it thee?
Love,
What shewed he thee?
love,
Wherefore shewed it he?
for love.
Hold one thee therein, and thou shalt learn, and no more in the same. But thou shalt never know nor learn therein other thing without end. Thus was I learned that love was our Lord's meaning. I saw full surely that ere God made us, he loved us, which love was never slacked, nor ever shall be. And in this love he hath done all his works, and in this love he hath made all things profitable to us. And in this love our life is everlasting. In our making we had beginning, but the love wherein he made us was in him from without beginning, in which love we have our beginning, and all this shall we see in God without end. God loved us before he made us, and his love has never diminished and never shall. That love of God is hard and marvelous, it cannot and will not be broken because of our sins.
Love was without beginning, is,
And shall be without ending.
he that made all things for love, by the same love keepeth them.
shall keep them without end.
We are kept all as securely in love, in woe as in weal, by the goodness of God.